good friend of mine. I've known him since college days. He's not only known for his rigorous science, but also for his temperament, and hence the nickname Mad Dog. So he'll be talking about the dynamics of Earth's vegetation as captured in the GIMS data that we just talked about. Ranga, go on.
Okay, thank you, Rama, with that very friendly introduction. The title of my presentation is Trends or Variability, and I will use vegetation index data to make certain points, simply because that is the data that I work with, and we'll build the outline gradually as we work through the presentation. As you can see at the bottom right hand corner that I have 36 PowerPoints, and so I will first start with some introductory material. So the question is, what happens when solar radiation strikes a green leaf? I thought that this kind of introduction is necessary given the broad audience. Not everyone listening to this talk is doing remote sensing of vegetation. So this is a very simple and broad presentation. What happens when solar radiation strikes a green leaf? So pigments in green leaves, notably chlorophyll, they absorb strongly at red and blue wavelengths, approximately less than 0.7 microns, and at wavelengths longer than 0.8 microns to about 0.8 to 1.1 microns or so, there is no such absorption. So there is considerable amount of radiation at those wavelengths exiting the leaf. To the top left, you see a schematic illustration by Gowarts of a cross-section of a green leaf. You have the upper epidermis, the lower epidermis, and in between these two layers, you have at the top the cylindrical vertical cells. This is the palisade parenchyma, I believe, and then below that is the spongy tissue. And the chlorophyll is mostly in the palisade layer. So this large jump that you see in the spectrum in the graph, where the x-axis is wavelength and the y-axis is reflectance, and you see considerable absorption at red wavelengths, that is at about 0.7 microns, and then pretty much by the time you hit 0.8 microns, there is no absorption and there is significant reflectance. And the transmittance spectrum is quite similar to the reflectance spectrum. And so there is considerable absorption at shorter wavelengths by pigments, and there is considerable scattering or non-absorption at near infrared wavelengths. So that gives that big jump. I'm going to use my cursor here, and this big jump is something that is unique to green leaves, and that's what Compton James Tucker has exploited to remote sense vegetation. So that is at a single leaf level, but as you know, leaves are arranged in canopies, and a canopy is just an assemblage of green leaves. And here you see a wonderful painting by Gustav Klimt, and it's called Der Park, and it nicely illustrates what a canopy is. And the red component of solar radiation is mostly absorbed by the pigments in the green leaves in a canopy, in this canopy, the Klimt canopy, if you will, and very little amount leaves this canopy at the top and at the bottom. And at near infrared wavelengths, most of the radiation is scattered out, especially from the top of the canopy, because the radiation is incident on the top of the canopy. So this big difference between the amounts of red and near-infrared components of solar radiation that is exiting the canopy is a function of the amount of green leaf area, as you can imagine. So one could think of a very simple index where you just take the difference between the red and the near-infrared, and that difference is proportional to the amount of leaf area or the amount of radiation that is absorbed or what have you, if you work out the equations, and just normalize it by the sum of the reflectances at those wavelengths. And you get an index which is called the normalized difference vegetation index. And to the best of my recollection, I think that this index was first, perhaps I noticed it in a paper by Deering and Park. I don't recall the year, but it should be early 80s or so. And NDVI, as you can see from this formulation, is a number that is between -1 and +1. And on land, the near-infrared reflectance is almost always greater than red reflectance. So you always have a positive number, generally speaking. And to the left-hand side is a nice illustration of this, where you see in barren areas, the NDVI is quite close to 0, if you are following my mouse here. And then as the amount of leaf area increases over the landscape, the NDVI increases monotonically and non-linearly. And this is the saturation problem that Compton James Tucker talked about. And why is this curve so broad, you might wonder? So if you were to look at a leaf area index of 2, so that is for every square meter, there is 2 square meters of one-sided green leaf area, and you have an NDVI that can be anywhere between 0.5 to 2.75, say, for example. It's just a schematic illustration. So the same amount of leaf area can be arranged in different ways in the canopy, because no two trees are alike in the same way that no two human beings look similar, except they're identical twins. So no two trees are alike, and no two canopies are alike. Their structure is different, so the same amount of leaf area will result in different values of NDVI. So that is the influence of the structure. So we are remote sensing the land, and we have satellites that are flying at great heights, and there is the atmosphere that is in between the satellite and the ground. And in the picture to the left-hand side, you see this satellite as it is zipping by. It's carrying instruments, and the instruments, like MODIS, for instance, they measure at different wavelengths, and they are sweeping swaths of hundreds of kilometers as the Earth rotates under them. And these swaths are pixels, if you will, square pixels of various resolution. In this picture, there is no sun, but actually you have sun outside, and the solar radiation passes through the atmosphere, hits the ground, and then goes back through the atmosphere to the sensor on the satellite. So for those of us who are interested in remote sensing of the land, the atmosphere is a nuisance, because we need to know something about the atmosphere. So the radiation that is, we only want the sensor on the satellites to measure radiation coming from the ground, not radiation coming from the atmosphere. So whenever there are clouds, we cannot do remote sensing, optical remote sensing. When there are no clouds, the atmosphere contains gases and aerosols. So there are ways that you can correct for that. So the result is as if you're looking at the surface, the land surface, or the water surface, with these sensors above us with no atmosphere. And there are, we are interested in land remote sensing. I have another nice image here where people can use other forms. We are using solar radiation. You could use other forms, microwave radiation, or actually you could have a sensor on the satellite itself, beam a pulse, and then it goes back and you can measure ocean wave heights and so on and so forth. So it's all very fascinating stuff. So at the end of the day, there are a lot of clever people and pioneers who have figured all of this out in the 70s and the 80s, and you have heard it's such a fortunate series of lectures, and I wish when I was a student I had an opportunity like this to listen to the speakers that you've been listening to before me, obviously. And so we're at a stage when we have this data, and you put together this data, and you have this view of the Earth that is quite startling. Here is this simple index which over land is a number that goes between 0 to 1, and you look at the Sahara, the numbers are quite close to 0, and if you look at the Amazon forest, the numbers are quite close to 1. And if you look at the temperate forests in the northern lands, you see the numbers are somewhere around 0.7. So this is very illustrative, very accurate depiction of the distribution of vegetation on our planet. Interestingly, you will see, for instance, in Africa, the rainfall gradients, as Compton Tucker mentioned, they more or less run parallel. And if you were to start with the Sahara and work inwards to Central Africa, Congo, for instance, you can see NDVI going from 0 to very high values. And there are these very, very nice bands. And if you can zoom in and look at them, they look actually extremely pretty. And in the same way, you can see that also in the starting near Caspian Sea in the Kazakh area and the steppes, there is a beautiful gradient as you go northwards into the boreal forests. So there is quite a lot of information here in these. And the question I was asking Dr. Tucker was, here we have Papua, if you can follow my cursor, here we have, I am not sure if this is Papua New Guinea, but it must be. And just south of it is Australia, and they're not very much farther apart, and yet you see what a difference. And last night I was wondering why there is. So there is so much information here, and there's so much to be gained from this kind of information. So that is the background thus far. So the rest of my talk is focused on two broad themes. First, I shall speak about the greening trend in the northern latitudes, and then I will speak about the greening of the Earth itself. So without further ado, let's first focus on the first topic on which I have lots of slides, the greening trend in the northern lands. Here is a photograph of Professor Charles David Keeling, and nearly everyone has heard of the Keeling curve, which is shown to the right. And Keeling, and this curve is etched into the wall in the lobby of the National Academy of Sciences building in Washington, D.C. And I was looking up last night at Wikipedia at the 10, 20 greatest scientific discoveries of the 20th century. And I did not find this. And I thought, this is surprising. In the popular imagination, if I were to ask people who went through high school, if they were to tell me the top 3 canonical discoveries of the 20th century, they would obviously, first thing they would say is the E is equal to mc squared by Einstein, and the second thing they might say is the double helix by Watson and Crick, and now the Keeling curve. So I would rank it as one of the greatest discoveries of the 20th century. And Keeling is known for these measurements of atmospheric CO2 concentration, etc., etc. little do people realize that Keeling has made a very important discovery, and I will work through this. The rest of my talk is, this is the starting point for the rest of my talk. Little do people realize, even 17 years after the publication of a key paper by Keeling et al. In Nature in 1996, that Keeling discovered the greening of the planet. Here is actual text from his papers, from this paper. Here where he says, here we report that the annual amplitude of the seasonal cycle of CO2 has increased by 20% as measured in Hawaii, and by 40% in the Arctic since the early 60s. The amplitude that Keeling is talking about is the difference between the peak and the trough of this wiggly CO2 curve that you see. So, and he's saying that the amplitude has increased by 20% as measured in Hawaii and 40% in the Arctic. And these increases are accompanied by phase advances of about 7 days during the declining phase of the cycle, the seasonal cycle, suggesting a lengthening of the growing season. What he's saying here is that you have this CO2 buildup during the boreal winter, and then the leaves appear, and then photosynthesis begins to happen, and then it will overtake respiration, and then it crosses this red line. And where it crosses this red line, he's saying that it is advancing earlier by about 7 days to the left. And he hypothesized, well, he wrote that we propose that this amplitude increase reflects increasing assimilation of CO2 by land plants in response to rapid increases in temperature. In a way, everything I'm going to say for the rest of my talk is refinement of these 3 sentences. Now, how can we verify? Keeling deduced that amplitude increase and longer growing seasons due to early springs from atmospheric CO2 data, but that came out in 1996. The question then was, how can we independently verify Keeling's discovery of a greener north and a lengthening growing season due to early spring growth spurt? I happened to be at Goddard, and I was working with Compton James Tucker, and he had previously published with Dave Keeling, so it was a natural connection that we had. Then we said, we can use the NDVI dataset to see if there is any concordance between what Keeling et al. Have reported the year before. So Jim Tucker, you just saw him give a speech, so this photo is redundant. He's dedicatedly put together 30 plus years of the NDVI dataset, which is widely used and has resulted in thousands of publications, so it needs no further introduction. I do want to emphasize that it is very difficult to dedicatedly produce these data sets over so many years because of the vagaries of funding and various other constraints. So these people are to be commended for making these data sets available, and that there are no breaks in them, and that they continue to produce these data sets, refine them, and importantly make them available to everybody to use. So GIMS is Global Inventory Monitoring and Modeling Systems, AVHRR. You know what it is. It's not very advanced. It's not very high resolution. So you look at the space, for instance, when Neil Armstrong looked back from the moon at the Earth, so you saw the blue marble, so which is a great achievement for mankind. And here to the left, I'm showing you the Tucker's marble. Before Jim Tucker, we did not look at the Earth in the same way. So, a seminal contribution. So, obviously, following on the heels of Keeling's landmark paper, so we at Goddard then worked, and we had about 10 years of NDVI data set that, thanks to Dr. Tucker, and we saw that the NDVI during the peak boreal growing season, July and August, increased by about 10%. So if you were to follow my cursor, I'm looking at this increase. And the timing of spring green-up advanced by about 6 days. That is, if you were to take an NDVI threshold of 0.18, for example, and you can see that the curves of the later years are advancing. So, or if you were to take a particular day, you can look at the NDVI change, and you can deduce an advance or delay in springtime value or springtime threshold value of NDVI. Do the same thing in autumn, and you can see a lengthening of growing season. I would not particularly say that this is a very accurate analysis, but nevertheless, it was the best we could do given our limitations. But generally, the results are concordant with Keeling's analysis of atmospheric CO2 data. So remember, this paper came out in '97, a year after Keeling et al.'s paper, and we had 10 years of data set, and that was enough of a, if you will, push to Dr. Tucker to rapidly produce and keep up with, extend the NDVI data record. So much so that in 2001, that we had nearly 18 years of NDVI data, 1982 to 1999, and Zhou et al. In the Journal of Geophysical Research published a paper where the key discovery seems to be that that we are seeing a persistent trend in greenness, meaning that the greening is persistent over this 18-year period in Eurasia, and you can see that here if you were to follow my cursor. And in comparison, in North America, the boreal region already seemed to show a fragmented pattern of change. So we already noticed at that time that there was some asymmetry developing between these trends in greenness increases between Eurasia and Asia, Eurasia and North America, my apologies. So currently we have the very latest NDVI data set from Dr. Tucker, and that's 30 years now, and it is from 1982 to 2011. And we have considerably refined our analytical skills now. We are able to do statistics very, very carefully, and not simple linear regressions. We now do very careful statistical analysis using methods that assess for stationarity of the data series and so on and so forth. Moreover, we are able to very carefully calculate the growing season duration, which I call here PAP, meaning photosynthetically active period, using freeze-thaw data, which is daily data. You have both AM and PM freeze-thaw state, so for 30 years. So you have daily freeze-thaw data, so you can calculate when the ground is thawed in the spring at a particular location. You can assume that that is the beginning of the growing season, and the ground is frozen in autumn, then you can assume that is the end of the growing season. So we're able to calculate this photosynthetically active period very accurately. We have excellent third generation NDVI data set, and we have now excellent statistical methods. And this is a paper by Xu et al. In preparation. It will go out in a couple of weeks to a journal. And the inference here is that about 34 to 41% of the northern vegetation, the boreal and the Arctic regions, are showing greening, and about 3 to 5% are showing browning, and 51 to 62% are showing no changes, and about 4% lack valid NDVI data. And So that's where we are now. The greening trend has continued over the last 30 years, and it is especially prominent in Eurasia, and especially in the Arctic regions, in both Eurasia and in North America. The obvious question, that is just an inference from analysis of data. Now we have to interpret that inference. And why is the North greening? So I will give you a simple example, and I try to give you a realistic, a simple explanation and a more realistic explanation. But I will admit right away that I do not know the real answer. The simplest explanation is, in the Arctic and in the boreal region, that vegetation growth is limited by temperature, and the warming of the past 30 years could be invoked to explain the greening trend. You can do this analysis statistically quite rigorously, and you will find that there is a statistically significant association between anomalies of growing season temperature and growing season NDVI. So at the scale of Arctic and boreal, this is very large scale, spatial scales, temperature seems to explain. But this is not the whole story, because when you do this kind of statistics for very large regions, they tend to hide the truth and the detail. In fact, if you were to go and try to explain all the places where we are seeing greening and browning, you really need to invoke or bring in a lot of other factors. Here I have 4 factors. There is warming-induced disturbance and recovery from disturbance. The disturbance itself could result in browning, and recovery from past disturbance could result in greening. There is the interaction effects of temperature and precipitation. You can have temperature going up and precipitation going down. You will have browning. If you have temperature and precipitation both going up, you can have greening. And then there are very complex feedbacks in the climate system itself, where you have asymmetrically significantly more amount of snow in Eurasia than in North America during the winter, and that tends to affect subsequent season plant growth. And also in the springtime, the snow cover extent on land, or the lack of it actually, as you saw from Jim Tucker's presentation, that tends to amplify springtime warming and early springtime plant growth. And there are also anthropogenic influences. The Russians have one of the huge smelters in Norilsk in Siberia, and that spews out an enormous amount of sulfur dioxide, and that in the atmosphere through reactions forms aerosols, and plus these smelters emit heavy metals into the ground, and extensive large areas of forests have been decimated practically, basically polluted and killed off. And in the north you also have the issue of the herding practices of the natives, of their caribou, or the reindeer as we call them here. You have land abandonment where the forests are returning and growing vigorously, and so on and so forth. In the Arctic you have shrinking, you have these ponds and lakes that are drying up, and then there is colonization of those newly formed lands with new vegetation. There is considerable evidence of increase in shrub cover in the Arctic, and so on and so forth. So you could invoke any number of reasons to explain in a certain location, and there is no single answer that will explain the greening that we are seeing in a realistic way. So that is the greening trend in the northern lands. And I've given you a summary. We started with the Keeling's discovery of the greening of the northern lands, inferred from atmospheric CO2 data. Then we looked at the first paper of mine, where we used 10 years of Dr. Tucker's NDVI data. Then we looked at Li-Ming Zhou's paper, where we analyzed 18 years of Jim Tucker's NDVI data, and Shu's paper, which is pretty much finished, where we're looking at 30 years of NDVI data, and they all seem to point to what Keeling had deduced from atmospheric CO2 data. Now, while the emphasis thus far has been on the northern lands, obviously the northern lands, because of the feedbacks, are where the warming is happening, and that's where the strongest signals of climate change are observed there. But they can also be observed elsewhere, and so we look at the whole Earth now, not just the North, which is the second half of my talk. And there is this key paper by Myneni et al. In 2003, where Dr. Tucker's NDVI dataset was used together with climate data to calculate net primary production of vegetation, and over an 18-year period. So this is very similar to Li-Ming Zhou's work that I showed, where Zhou analyzed NDVI data for 18 years. Here, Myneni et al. Produced calculated net primary production and looked at trends, and this is a figure from that paper. And they write that our results indicate that global changes in climate have eased several critical climatic constraints to plant growth, such that net primary production increased by 6% over the 18-year period. I will explain in the next slides what it means. Global changes in climate have eased several critical climatic constraints to plant growth. That is a complex sentence, so we'll have to parse that. Before we parse it, let us say, now that we have 30 years of Dr. Tucker's data, and we are able to calculate very carefully the growing season, we just integrate the NDVI over the growing season and take that as a surrogate for vegetation production. And so you're looking at trends in this. What is shocking is that you are seeing that the planet is greening. Actually, 20% of the vegetated area shows increases in growing season integrated NDVI in the latest improved version of Dr. Tucker's NDVI dataset. And only 3% of the vegetated area shows decreases in this surrogate variable of vegetation production. So that's an update to Myneni et al.'s paper, now done with 30 years of improved data sets and better analytics. So what is surprising me is that you see this greening, about, if you were to follow my cursor again, about 20% of the area, vegetated area, the total vegetated area on our planet is about 115 million square kilometers. So to give you an example, the lower 48 states of the USA is about 9.5 million square kilometers. So 20% of the vegetated area is showing greening, and only 3% is showing browning. And when you translate that to productivity, we are seeing an increase in productivity of about 16% and a decline in productivity of only 3% in the aggregate at the global scale. But if you were to look at all the vegetation types or land covers, you see that this increase is not confined to any one particular vegetation type. You see it in all vegetation types. And interestingly, the more productive vegetation types, such as the evergreen broadleaf forests, and the mixed forests, and the woody savannas, and now obviously the croplands. Those are the ones, the more productive vegetation types are showing more greening and more productivity. So the obvious question is, why is the earth greening? Already Myneni et al. Had provided an answer which at that time seemed, in 2003, remember, seemed sufficient, that global changes in climate have eased several climatic constraints to plant growth. In hindsight, we now wonder if that is the case over the entire 30-year period. So the question is, why is the earth greening? So the hypothesis is, the Myneni et al. Hypothesis is, relaxation of climatic constraints to plant growth. We throw in some more fertilization effects. For instance, CO2 has increased from, in the last 30 years, maybe it has increased from 330 ppm to So in our analysis, we don't include croplands for the time being. So what are these climatic constraints to plant growth? This is a very key concept to come from Myneni et al. And the University of Montana, Missoula group. Climate is seen as availability of water, follow my cursor please, availability of water, temperature, and sunlight. And if a region is purely water limited, such as the arid areas, it will appear in red color. If the region is purely limited by sunlight, in this picture, it will appear as green, the Amazonian forest, for instance. And if a region is purely limited by temperature, it will appear in blue, as in the northern areas. But if a region is limited by both water availability and temperature, it will appear purple. If it is limited by water and sunlight, it will appear as yellow. And if it's limited by all three, it will appear as some color at the center of this triangle. So that means that here we have a very nice way of looking at every location, vegetated location on our planet, whether it is water limited, temperature limited. So I was talking about this map of climatic constraints to plant growth, which is essentially tells us that for every vegetated location, the limiting factors to plant growth. So this is a good starting point and for our analysis. So now I'm going to present work where we are trying, by Zhu et al., where we are trying to understand why is the entire earth greening. 20% of the earth is greening, but the greening is not limited to the northern latitudes. So let us take, I'll work you through a couple of examples. One limiting factor. Let us say a pixel or vegetation at a certain location is purely water limited. And here I have a slide here where you see a shrubland, and this is the kind of vegetation that's purely water limited. And we find this vegetation here to be greening in the NDVI dataset, for example, over a 30-year period. The question is why? So there are two possible answers. And to find the correct answer, what we do is we analyze a time series that overlaps with the NDVI time series of precipitation. And if we see that precipitation has increased over this 30-year period, and we can attribute the greening at that location to the case of relaxation of a climatic constraint, because the vegetation in that location is constrained only by the availability of water, and precipitation has increased, so the greening can be attributed to a relaxation of climatic constraint. That's what Myneni et al. Were talking about in their paper. Now, on the other hand, if precipitation at that location shows no trend or even a decreasing trend, but in the NDVI data set, we see that it is greening, then we cannot, it is not a case of relaxation of climatic constraint because the precipitation is showing a decreasing trend or no trend. So then we have to look for an alternate answer. The alternate answer could be CO2 fertilization, nitrogen deposition, or some anthropogenic influence. Obviously, this is the simplest case. Now, you take the case of where you have two limiting factors that limit plant growth at a location, and I take the example of water and temperature, as in the boreal region, for instance. And if we find the vegetation in that location is greening, and if we find that both precipitation and temperature has increased at that location over the 30-year period, we attribute the greening at that location to abbreviation C, which under the table you will see as climatic constraint relaxation. On the other hand, if you find that precipitation has decreased and temperature has decreased, then, but we find that the pixel is greening, then we attribute that to the case of fertilization. And the third case is the pixel is greening and the water availability or precipitation has decreased, but temperature has increased. So in that case, we really do not know what the answer is. So we have this case of unknown. So you can imagine we can prepare a very long table where we have, in this table here, you see water and temperature limiting. You can have water and radiation limiting cases. You can have radiation and temperature limiting cases. And then you have water, radiation, and temperature limiting cases. And then for each of those greening pixels, together with the climatic constraint map and the climatic data sets, we can work out whether it is a case of relaxation of climatic constraints or fertilization or unknown. And we end up with a result where we find that 50% of the greening that we are seeing in the 30-year NDVI data set from Dr. Tucker can be attributed to relaxation of climatic constraints. And the other 50% is possibly due to fertilization, maybe CO2, the increase in CO2, nitrogen deposition, anthropogenic influences, and so on. And 1% is due to unknown reasons. So that is an answer. The analysis as far as the relaxation of climatic constraints is reasonably rigorous. The attribution to fertilization is somewhat speculative and not on very solid grounds, and we have to further refine this before this paper goes out to publication. So there you have the outline now. I gave you an introduction and I spoke of the greening trend in the northern lands that Keeling first reported, and which is subsequently confirmed by the gradual increase in the length of the NDVI data record from Dr. Tucker. And Myneni has taken the bold step of actually trying to apply and see what is happening at the entire Earth. And he surprisingly reported that it's just not the north, but in fact the strongest increases in productivity are seen in the Amazonian forests and the tropical areas. And we have now looked at, but that paper attributed most of that, a lot of that increase in net primary production to relaxation of climatic constraints. And we have taken that now as 2 steps further. We have increased the length of the data to 30 years. We can confirm the earlier report of Myneni et al. Plus we can throw in addition to relaxation of climatic constraints, an additional variable, interesting but speculative, that perhaps from space we are observing a carbon dioxide fertilization effect. And we go to the summary. It's a very simple summary. I said my talk is simple. So the Earth has been greening over the past 30 years. About 20% of the vegetated area is showing this tendency. And this greening translates to an approximately 16% increase in gross primary production. And the earth is greening because of relaxation of climatic constraints. About half of it can be explained by relaxation of climatic constraints. And the other half possibly due to fertilization effects from increased CO2, N deposition, anthropogenic influences, etc., etc. Now, going back to the title of my talk, is this 30-year greening a trend or part of a low-frequency variability? This is very, very important that often you see so many papers published with extremely poor statistics, and I really wish that the students working on these topics take statistics very seriously. It is very important that either you know statistics very well, the statistics that you put in your paper, or at least you work with a statistician. There are so many of them who would happily collaborate with you. Most of you are at universities. Please make friends with statisticians. Else it's going to come back, whatever you write, and like a boomerang. And So here, let's look at variability or trend. I'm showing you station temperature data on land from NASA Goddard Institute for Space Studies. If you were to look at the temperature time series for the period, 25-year period between 1940 and 1975, there is no warming. If you were to look from the 1975 onwards, whoa, you see extraordinary warming. If you were to look at 1940 to the present, you wonder what is going on. The first 25 years there's no warming, and then the last 35 years there is significant warming. And if you look at the entire time series, you can say with reasonable confidence that there is a warming trend. If we had 300, 400, 500 years of data, maybe we will look at this curve differently. Okay, so the length of the record is very important. The statistics that you do on this data series are very important. The most important thing is you need to assess whether the time series is stationary or not. If it is stationary, you can do simple linear trend analysis. If it is not stationary, you have to use some powerful methods. There are no workarounds to assessing significance and trend estimates if the time series is not stationary. So statisticians have worked on those problems. They have approximate solutions to those problems. So you simply cannot fit a straight line to a time series and then report it as a trend. Okay, you need to do very rigorous statistics. And anyway, so that is very important. The length of the record is important. And we are only looking at 30 years of Dr. Tucker's NDVI dataset. And we are seeing an increase, a greening trend. We are saying greening trend. But I'm not so sure that it is a trend. If I had 100 or 200 years of NDVI data, maybe we can say something. It could very well be part of some long-term low-frequency variability, and there's going to be a very interesting talk tomorrow by a statistician. So we're all looking forward to that. So the question is this 30-year greening a trend or part of some low-frequency variability? The answer is I do not know. We are looking at a snapshot. But what we do know is that the snow cover on land in the spring, on northern lands in the spring period, has been progressively declining, and that is positively feedbacking on temperature. And springtime temperatures have increased significantly, and spring is coming early. And here I have a picture of Botticelli, and in the center you see Venus. To the very left you see Mercury, and between Venus and Mercury you see the three Graces. And then you see the goddess Flora in a very pretty dress, and then you see the wind god Zephyr, who is harassing a nymph, and his breath makes flowers sprout from her mouth. So extremely beautiful picture. So anyway, so coming to the last few slides, you have heard of the expression standing on the shoulders of giants. And this actually is derived from Greek mythology. You know, Orion was a great huntsman, and he wanted to marry. The mythology is quite confusing, but what I could get from it is he wanted to marry the daughter of a king, I think Ornithon, and Ornithon did not want that, and so he had Orion blinded. So Orion then came to the island of Lemnos, and then he had this little boy. He's not a dwarf, he's just a little boy, Caladon, sit on his shoulders, and then they walked east where the god Helios cured his blindness. So that is actually what it means. That's the source of it, standing on the shoulders of giants. And so if you stand on the shoulders of giants, you can see very far. So here are the giants. So I started with Professor Keeling, who is very well known for atmospheric CO2 data, etc., etc., etc. But little do people recognize that Keeling discovered an entirely new field, that of the greening earth. And the three sentences that I quoted from his paper being basically refined. We were able to refine the dwarfs that we are all. We were able to refine those three sentences in Professor Keeling's landmarks paper through Dr. Jim Tucker's NDVI data. So here are the two giants. And you see, one final remark, I had inserted several works of art in my presentation. If I were to explain why I did that, it is simply to say that the human spirit has some sort of a sense of aesthetic that we find in nature around us. After all, we draw landscapes, we don't draw landfills. And so in that sense, the work that we are doing is, it may not seem as big as the discovery of the Higgs boson or the God's particle, but nevertheless, the work that we do, the environment, it is intrinsically connected to the human spirit and the human condition. So at that point, I stop and I'll take questions. Thank you.
Ranga, if I could start out with the first question. I'm curious as to what's occurred with the carbon dioxide record since Keeling's '96 paper on the variation in the cyclicity. Is that 20% that he identified been keeping up, or has it changed?
The question is, have there been updates to the landmark Keeling paper, because it came out in 1996. I believe Wolfgang Bürmann et al. Have extended that analysis, and they have done some very nice work, which is published in the proceeding. So the PNAS, and maybe pretty soon there may be a paper from Ralph Keeling's group on that. So we will have to wait for that analysis.
Do you have a sense, either from the global greening trend or the northern greening trend, what proportion of that greening is due to changing phenology versus the increased magnitude that, traditional seasonal max?
Okay, when I say greening, I mean increases in growing season average or integrated NDVI. So that is the area under the bell-shaped curve. Area is length times width. Width is the growing season, length is the amplitude. So when I say greening, I mean statistically significant increase at 10% or 5% level of significance in the area under the shape. So I'm not disentangling the increase that is due to amplitude and due to growing season.
Hi, Ranga. Thanks
Yes.
for the comprehensive lecture. And I have a question: is that possible the following two reasons could largely influence the trend of the NDVI? One is that the satellite-based measurement of NDVI in the tropical rainforest, especially during the growing season. I know you have some publications on the Amazon. So if we have large amount of clouds over or in the growing season, is that possible? The satellite will have large biases in measurement of NDVI. And the other problem is that if the interannual variation of NDVI and also even the extreme event will largely influence the trend of NDVI. So let's say for the following several years, we're going to have more and more drought years, then the NDVI will largely decrease. So if that could be a possible reason to influence the result. Thanks.
Yeah. There are two questions from the students in the audience here. The first question has something to do with clouds in the Amazon. Obviously, all throughout my talk, I've referred to as Dr. Tucker's NDVI dataset. And I should have referred it to as Dr. Jorge Pinzon's and Tucker's NDVI analysis dataset. So Jorge Pinzon in Dr. Tucker's group, who does the processing, does to the best of his ability to correct for all these corrupting influences. Fortunately, in the Amazon, the growing season is year long, so there is a dry season, of course. There are residual problems in the data set. You're right. And your second question is, if you have several years of drought, that may influence these trends. And that's why I say, a trend or variability, we do not know. At first, as a rule of thumb, we thought 30 years of data is enough to tease out signals. And now, as we learn more about the climate system, all of us are hedging, and there is a pushback. We no longer believe that 30 years is enough, that we need longer-term data sets. So, yes, yeah. Other questions?
I have a question. So yesterday you were asking John Townsend about forest cover, and he indicated that the forest cover itself is going down. Is it possible that the green cover is going up while the forest cover is going down?
It is to me. You remember when we do this analysis with NDVI, we are working at a resolution of 8 by 8 kilometer pixels. So, and when people do deforestation studies, they work at extremely high resolution, 30-meter resolution and so on. So that is why I asked that question to Dr. Townsend. Yes, it's clearly we are losing forest to deforestation and conversion to other uses, crops and so on and so forth. But in the aggregate, the NDVI dataset, the GIMS NDVI dataset, or if somebody else were to process the same raw data, I'm sure they would come up with an equivalent dataset. We will find the same greening trend. So clearly we are looking at 20% of the earth has greened over the last 30 years, and that translates approximately to about 15-16% increase in productivity. So yeah.
Kay Zhang has a follow-up to that, asking that, he says, do you think greening equals vegetation productivity increase? You showed it, the modeled GPP as a similar result to GIMS, NDVI. How about NPP?
Yeah, that's a good question. So we should not, as Dr. Tucker has pointed out, that the NDVI is based on satellite measurements of reflected radiation. So through groundwork, they have established, at least in herbaceous vegetation, that it is correlated to biomass. But for most areas of the world, the NDVI is a proxy, really a proxy for gross production. It is not to be interpreted in terms of net primary productivity, carbon sinks, and so on and so forth. Okay? Please. Questions from the wider audience on the internet?
Yeah, there are a number of questions there. I can see them. The last one is about CO2 fertilization effect. Where is it most likely to be detectable?
Yes, that is interesting question. The CO2 fertilization, obviously, would we detect it in warm, arid areas where there are C4 plants and grasses? Would we see that there? But I would assume the imprint of CO2 fertilization should be seen everywhere on the planet. To some extent or the other. In some cases we may see it stronger, in other vegetation types we may see it less stronger, but if we were to identify a CO2 fertilization effect, then it has to be uniformly or more reasonably seen everywhere in all vegetation types. I would say that is a prerequisite.
In that vein, with respect to the classification in your own work there, where you're saying, okay, either it's a relaxed and climatic constraint or CO2 fertilization, kind of tossing it one or the other, is there a spatial distribution that kind of presents itself in that context? Are there regions where you have, a lot of climate constraints being eased and other regions where it's being flagged as CO2 fertilization?
Yes, we have those maps, and that's work in progress, so I have not included them here. Okay. Yes.
Okay.
Okay, going back. The question from Jong Hong, or shall we go up to the first questions? And then we can work them downwards. Is that the first question for me, Jennifer?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's not the first question, but that one's probably a good one to look at.
Okay, yeah. Okay, the question is how to interpret the seasonal variation of NDVI for very dense canopies where LAI is very high, say in Amazon evergreen forest. We know that NDVI is still very seasonal, interannually there. Yeah, that's a good question, because these forests are very dense and the NDVI and the EVI tend to saturate, and the work that we have done shows that the intra-annual signal is quite strong, so we are able to capture that in NDVI and EVI over Amazonian forests, but the interannual signal, especially the signal that you would see in a drought year versus a non-drought year, if the drought is not very strong, that may not be visible because these values are saturated. Jay has land cover, land use change been addressed as a driver of greening in different regions globally that is recovering from harvesting? It has not been addressed. I should have included that in my speculative cases of CO2 fertilization, nitrogen deposition, recovery from disturbances, etc., land abandonment, and so on and so forth. So there are any number of reasons, because we are seeing the signature everywhere. The analysis as far as attribution to relaxation of climatic constraints is reasonably rigorous, but that's only 50%. That explains only 50% of the greening globally. The other 50%, the analysis is somewhat speculative. It could be carbon fertilization, carbon dioxide fertilization plus nitrogen deposition, but then nitrogen deposition is not everywhere. So plus there are all these anthropogenic influences. For instance, the herding practices of herbivores in the north, land abandonment and returning forests, and so on and so forth. So there are any number of reasons one can give as far as why the planet is greening, So if you were to tabulate them, that would be a very long list.
Also, Berger asks, the recent initiatives for reprocessing AVHR are a long time series in generating biophysical products, including LAI. How will these contribute to better quantifying the tendencies or trends or variability?
Yes, I mean the data, all the results that I have presented, not the retrospective ones that have been published, but the results that are in preparation, they have all been done with Dr. Tucker's latest version of NDVI dataset, which is called NDVI 3G. 3G standing for third generation. It is the state-of-the-art NDVI dataset that we have, and we have done analysis comparing that to the MODIS NDVI product for the overlapping 10, 11 years, and there seems to be generally good conformity between the two data sets. And we also derived a 30-year LAI and FPAR data set from the NDVI 3G data set, which is available to anybody who is interested in working with those data sets. So that is the current state of art. It is not satisfactory, but we can do better if in the future.
If you scroll down, Mike, there's one question at the, that's just been asked. Well, the one about LAI co-varying with EVI in the Amazon.
Yeah. It says, do you think LAI co-varies with EVI in the Amazon? So there are two papers regarding the Amazon LAI variation. The paper in PNAS was the first one, and recently there's a paper in Journal of Geophysical Research or Journal of Biogeosciences, and we find that actually that in the Amazon, the LAI result conforms to the one that we published previously in PNAS, but the EVI signal, when carefully analyzed toward the Amazonian forest, it tends not to follow the radiation signal, but tends to be more strongly correlated to the precipitation signal. So that is kind of surprising. So that is contradictory to what was published earlier by Alfredo Huete and ourselves, that the earlier version of the EVI actually tracked the radiation seasonality in the Amazonian forest, but the newer version of the EVI is tracking the precipitation signal. So much so that there is no difference in the seasonal cycle, the phase and so on and so forth of the EVI over the Amazonian forest and the adjacent savannas. Savannas, as you know, the EVI signal should track the precipitation signal, and the LAI also tracks the precipitation signal.
Well, thank you, Ranga. With that, I think we should close this morning's session, and thank you very much for coming and giving this great talk.
Thank you.